Good morning and welcome to Environmental Health Science 660. This will be our second lecture on, our second video on Lecture 4. Our first one on Lecture 4 was on Earth Major Ecosystems. This lecture today will be on world populations. This will be the last of the 3 posted videos. I have posted the videos, which were the remainder of the slides from our third lecture on fundamentals of ecology. So the last part of that lecture was posted. We have also now posted the Earth's major ecosystems, and then finally this lecture, which will be human populations. Given the length of time to get all 3 of these videos done, that encompasses the time for our class, so I'm not going to post more video time than our normal class would be. So we will pick up the lecture on urbanization and populations in class on our September the 24th, along with water quality, the hydrological cycle. So we're going to jump right into tonight's lecture, which is human populations. Since 2004, nearly 80 million people are added annually to world populations, or more than that. So that translates to roughly about 1 billion people every 12 years. Now, our present global world population is between 6 and 7 billion people. And so continuing to grow. And if we look at countries like China with 1.3 billion and India 1.1 billion, those together comprise more than a third of the world's population, 37%. The U.S., on the other hand, only has about 0.3 billion, and we contribute less than 5% of the world's population. So that's why we talked last time in earlier lectures about how we consume 30% of the world's energy with only 5% of the world's population. That becomes a very significant deal. So just to kind of put those numbers in context. Now, over the next 50 years, developed countries will not add appreciably large numbers of population because they have pretty much reached stability in how their birth rates and death rates are balanced to provide more stable population growth. So together, the developed nations will have about 1.2 to 1.5 billion people. Developing countries, on the other hand, will add another 8 billion by 2050. So as you can see, those with a high standard of living are going to be a smaller and smaller minority compared to the rest of the world. Countries with the highest rate of population growth at 2050 will be, with the largest amount of population will be India, China, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. Now, one of the reasons for this rapid rate of population growth since 1945 has been the fact that life expectancy worldwide has increased by nearly 30 years. This has been the result of public health prevention, that is, preventing deaths from heart disease and cancer by lifestyle changes, medical intervention, and also more early detection. So this has not been curative medicine, it's been really preventive medicine. Now, that is the type of medicine and public health we practice in developed nations. Sadly, few people are trained in prevention and disaster mitigation around the world. For example, in 6 years of medical school training in India, there is no formal training in global health in prevention, despite considerable interest worldwide, and despite the fact that in India they have earthquakes, monsoons, and things such as this, which are natural disasters, as well as they have illnesses that could be much better treated with preventive health programs. This is a map of life expectancy worldwide, and these are in years, so the scale is in years. Let's start with the North America, Canada, Mexico, United States. Something a little closer to home. You can see life expectancy here is over 75 years. If we look at the dark green, where there's the highest life expectancy, places like Japan, some of your Scandinavian countries, and Australia, we see the highest rates of life expectancy over 80 years. And then if we take a look at the countries like Russia, for example, because of a high rate of alcoholism there, you see life expectancy down in the 60s. And then if we go to the places with the lowest life expectancy, they're the sub-Sahara countries of Africa and a couple of countries in the Middle East. And so it's the very same countries that do not have these preventive health programs that have the lowest life expectancy. So you can see, add 30 years to life expectancy there due to prevention, and you're right there with the rest of the world. So this really means that, you know, there is a real disparity worldwide in terms of life expectancy. In many of these countries where we have low life expectancy, the major cause of death is still infectious disease, whereas in these highly developed nations it's cancer, heart attack, and stroke. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about population dynamics for a little bit, and we're going to introduce a couple of terms and talk about the inputs and outputs on population. The inputs on population are births and immigration. We'll talk about the birth rate. The crude birth rate is defined as the number of live births in a population each year. And so I'm going to skip this map and go to the next slide. I've got it blown up a little bigger where you can see it. So if we take a look at crude birth rates worldwide, you'll notice that in sub-Saharan Africa, we have crude birth rates of over 50 births per thousand, whereas if we look at places with developed nations like Canada, United States, most of Europe, and Russia, we generally see birth rates of less than 20 per 1,000. And so that difference makes a dramatic difference in whether you have increasing populations or decreasing populations. So this becomes a very significant part of our the differences between growing populations in developing nations as opposed to stable populations where there's a balance between birth rates and death rates. And we'll get to death rates here in just a moment. Now, death rates are defined as the number of deaths per 1,000 in a population each year. And so, again, the outputs in terms of population dynamics are deaths. So your births are your inputs, your deaths are your outputs, and then you also have immigration with an I as an input, and immigration, that is migration out, with an E, immigration, as one of your additional outputs. But the drivers for most of your population growth are the births and deaths. So let's talk a little bit more now about death rates. So if we look at this worldwide on death rates, you'll see that the countries with the highest death rates have, in dark blue to medium shade blue, have anywhere from over 20 deaths per 1,000 per year to 15 to 20 per 1,000 per year. You'll notice the countries with the lowest death rates have less than, such as in North America, Canada, United States, some of your developed nations in Europe, and some of North Africa, and also some of your countries, China and Australia and South America. We see less than 10 deaths per 1,000. So if your inputs are between 10 and 15 or less than 20, that is births, and your deaths are less than 10, that tends to lead to a pretty slow rate of population growth. On the other hand, if your inputs are much higher than your outputs in terms of birth and death, which is what we see in most of sub-Saharan Africa and in places where we have high population growth, that's where we see real increases in world population. This next slide depicts this birth rates and death rates, birth rates in yellow and death rates in blue. And let's start with the birth rates. You'll notice worldwide we have 21 births per 1,000 versus 9 deaths. So that leads to a net increase in population growth. If you take a look at the developed nations, like the United States, most of Europe, your large economic powers, you'll notice that birth rates and death rates 11 and 10 are virtually identical. And that's why we're not adding many people. When we talk about only adding 1.2 to 1.5 billion people there, as opposed to adding 8 billion in less developed countries. We see that as we look at this slide as we move on down. If we take a look in this region, we see that there are 20 in developing nations, like in sub-Saharan Africa, we have 24 births per 1,000 and 8 deaths per 1,000. So as you can see, much higher rates of population growth. And then if we take out China from those developing nations, you'll see the number is 29 and 9. So very, very high rates of population growth. And that's why we're adding nearly 8 billion people by 2050 in these countries, as opposed to very stable population growth here in these countries. Very high population growth here in the developing nations, and very low population growth in the developed nations of Europe and North America. This next slide, we look at birth rates and death rates by region, and you can clearly see why we have such dramatic problems in Africa with the disparity between birth rates and death rates. 38 live births per 1,000, 14 deaths. So life expectancy is not as good there. You'll notice the rest of the world, it ranges from around 6 to 9 in terms of deaths. You'll notice that the birth rates are much lower in the developing nations, North America, United States, pretty much in Europe. You can see that the birth rates are anywhere from 10 to 15, and you'll notice that in Europe in general, the death rates are higher than the birth rates. So that there is net population growth in Europe, and a lot of that has to do with Russia and some of the problems there. But overall, there's very little population growth where we have really balanced births and deaths. You'll also notice that we have, I should mention this too, not only Africa, but also in Latin America and Asia, some of the Pac Rim countries, we still have high rates of birth rates. The death rates have come down as we have begun to practice some better medicine there, but clearly the birth rates have not. And we're going to come back and talk about some of the problems of bringing birth rates down in just a moment. When we talk about population growth, we really subtract birth rates from death rate, or excuse me, birth rates minus death rates. Subtract the death rates from the birth rates, divided by, that's per 1,000, divided by 100, and that gives you essentially your percent annual rate of population growth. So in 1963, the global population growth rate was 2.2%. In 2004, we had nearly cut that by 50%. To 1.25%. And I think what's most striking, the population growth in the developing world was 0.1% annual population growth rate, whereas it's over 10 times higher in developing nations, 1.5%. We're going to come back in a little bit and talk about the consequences of what this means when you have population growth rates so high. It means you have population doubling times less than 50 years. So we'll come back and talk about some of that in just a moment here. Now, in this slide, we talk a little bit about the total births or fertility rate, and the total fertility rate is the average number of children a woman will have in her childbearing years. For example, if we look at the United States, that total fertility rate is about 2 children per woman. If we look in countries in Europe like Spain, it's about 1.2, Russia about 1.2. If we go to Afghanistan, for example, is 5.9. If we go to Angola, it's nearly 6.7 children. So as you can see, that total fertility rate really is a huge issue. The replacement fertility rate is 2.1 children in developing nations and 2.5 in in countries with high population growth. Now, there's a real problem here. Anytime our percent population growth, like we have at 1.25%, that equals to a doubling time of around 56 years. So basically, if you divide 70 by the percent population growth, whatever it may be, that defines your population doubling time. So in this case, 70 divided by 1.25 equals 56. In 2002, the global total fertility rate was 2.8, was 1.6 births per woman during childbearing years in developed nations like United States, the G8, the economically developed countries of the world, Europe. It's 3.1, nearly double that in developing nations. In 1950, though, look, and you can see that it was 2.5% in developing countries and 6.5. So things have been coming down. That is, the number of births per woman have been going down globally for the last 60 to 70 years, which has led to lower overall population growth. But the problem is we still have places where population growth is way too high. Next slide is a projection of world population growth using a low, high, and medium scenario, assuming different fertility rates. Obviously, the high rate assumes a high fertility rate of over 2%, or 2 births per mother. In fact, it's based on 2.6, and as you can see, with that kind of population growth, we generally see that within a very short period of time, we have population growth rapidly increasing. As you can see, with that high fertility rate, our world population by 2050 will be well over 11 billion, or approaching 11 billion people. Under the low scenario, with 1.7 births per mother during childbearing years, you'll notice that the world population generally tends to stabilize at around 7 billion, and with the intermediate rate of 2.1 births during those childbearing years, you'll see that it's going to be around 8.5 to 9 billion people. So clearly, the focus on cultural changes to reduce the number of births is one of the keys to sustaining more stable worldwide population growth. And really, when we look at the world's resources in terms of food and energy and things such as this, all you have to do is divide by the number of people with the amount of energy and food that we have, and that really defines the standard of living we have. And for example, you have to have the wealth in a country in order to be able to have energy and food. It is a measure of the standard of living. And obviously, if you have a stable population with stable income and can afford those things, then quality of life is good. On the other hand, if you have a rapidly increasing population and wealth continues to get divided in half every 20 to 30 years, your standard of living goes way down. And those are just really the real facts of life in terms of the world we live in. In this slide, we see global fertility rates plotted. And again, let's start in the United States. We have between 2 and 2.9 births per woman in the U.S. As we look at Europe, Russia, Canada, most of your highly developed economic countries of the world, what we generally see are birth rates of less than 2 births per woman. Then as we move into parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where we have the highest rates of population growth, highest birth rates, we generally see that there we have over 5 births per female, anywhere from 4 to 5. And so by and large, that is really where population growth is centered, is in those countries where we have that highest rate of population growth. So it really is, the focus really does have to be on reproductive strategies. The other places that we see high rates of population growth are in some of the Central American countries, as well as in some of the countries in South America, where we still have over 4 births per female, and also some parts of Asia and the Middle East. Now, this really is a slide looking at total births per woman in the U.S. Starting in 1920 and projected out to around 2020 for 100 years. And so what we really see is the period of time in the 1920s. You'll notice that we see generally during the Depression, number of births dropped in around the 1930 time period. Then we come up to World War II and the numbers drop dramatically. Then post-World War II, we have what's called the baby boom, which is when all the veterans came back from the war and basically produced a large cohort, over 3 births per woman. And then we see by the 1970s, with a focus on world population and the environmental movement, things such as this, we generally see births now drop down to below 2 and have stabilized right in that region of around 2 since that time period. So this is a real very interesting graph just to sort of show you reproductive patterns here in this country. We also see in the 1970s the advent of oral contraception, and I think that has made a huge difference in terms of maintaining the number of births at a much lower rate. So again, that is a preventive program if you're trying to control health by not having more children. So the oral contraceptives play a big role in this, as well as some of the societal attitudes. We know today that it's just, we have moved really from the 1920s and 30s, where we had an agrarian society where you need lots of people on a farm, to an industrial society where people work in technology jobs and things such as this. You just do not need that large family size that we needed during a different era with a different type of economy. And the cost of education and having a high standard of living in this country really precludes most people from being able to afford more than two children. This next slide, we take a look at the crude birth rates. Now, this is births per 1,000 in population. So what we really see is in the 1920s, we had begun to see the process of a demographic transition with the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of the airplane, production of automobiles, moving into more of an industrial economy. You'll see that the birth rates had per 1,000 had gone down, really sort of peaking at the end of the 1930s during the Depression. Then after World War II, we have what's called the baby boom, where the birth rates went back up again. And then again, we see that decline in the 60s and 70s, with again changing economic conditions, changing societal issues, and more intervention techniques with birth control. And so we have what's called, sort of in the 1980s, the children of the baby boomers begin to produce their offspring. So we have again another surge of births per 1,000. But again, things have pretty well stabilized since that time as the baby boomers have sort of ended that period of childbearing years. So we really see things are, once again moving down on the downside. So here we see a slide of projected U.S. population growth from the 1900s, where we had 76 million people, to out to the year 2100, where it was projected we'll have over 571 million people. You'll notice that by the year 2000, we were sitting at 273 people. So if you take a look at this curve, 75, if you look and see when we started with about 76 million at the turn of the 1900s, you'll notice that by around 1950, with a 50-year period, we see populations double to 150 million. If we take a look from the 1950s at 150 million to 300 million, you'll see that again by around the 1990s, or a little later, around 2020, we will be approaching 300 million. So you'll see that population doubling times have gotten a little shorter here as our birth rates and death rates, our birth rates in particular, have come down. So you can see that pretty much for the rest of the next, if we take a look at 300 million to 600 million, you'll now see we're on a trajectory of moving from around 30 to 40 years for doubling times up to 80 to 100 years, which is a much more stable population type of growth. And we really want to see it where there's no net population growth into the future. Now, the U.S. population is expected to increase from 288 million to 410 million by 2050. Immigrants and descendants of immigrants will make up 63% of this expected population growth. So when we take a look at U.S. population growth, we have a big debate about immigration, and I don't think sometimes we realize why it's such a big part of our population growth, is why we have to focus on it. Because as you add people in, you do dilute the wealth and the standard of living in this country. So you do have to pay attention to this debate. Now, we greatly benefit, as I've said earlier, from science and technology, where we've had immigration of people that come to this country for education, that stay and live and contribute. But I think we have to be very careful about illegal immigration and some of those things, because there are some unprecedented consequences, particularly where people are not paying into social systems and networks, healthcare networks, and things like this. So each addition to the U.S. population has an enormous, what we call environmental potential. I think another factor we have to consider in the U.S. population is that over 50% of the U.S. population lives in the urban zone, or in the coastal zone, and this is due to coastal urbanization. And so I really think we have to pay attention to this, because these two factors really have a dramatic impact on the population dynamics and the standard of living and the quality of life here. Now, we talked earlier about population doubling time, so let's talk specifically about this. And if you take a look at Eastern Europe, Russia, Hungary, Germany, our net population growth there is negative growth. That is minus 0.1 to minus 0.5. And we mentioned Russia in particular has a high infant mortality rate and a high rate of male mortality associated with drinking vodka and alcoholism. So because of that, we do not see hardly any net population growth there. On the other hand, if we look at other developed nations like in Europe, like Spain, we see zero population growth, which means you double your population about every 2,000 years. Now that is a much more sustainable rate of growth than every 40 or 50 years. You'll notice Japan about 0.2% and a doubling time of 318 years. The United States, like I said, 0.5%, 140 years. That's much better than we were doing just 100 years ago, where it was 35 to 40 years for doubling time. So we are improving there. China, about 1%, so 70 years. Venezuela, 2% population growth, 35 years. Nigeria, a 3% rate of population growth, 24 years. And then the Congo, 3.2%, 22 years. Now, I have mentioned this to you earlier. When we take a look at the United States, while net population change is slow, 140 years, we do have in our coastal zone, because of all the rapid urbanization and development, particularly retirees that are baby boomers moving here to retire, this region of the U.S. has population doubling times on the same order of magnitude that we see in Nigeria and in Congo, 25 to 15 to 20, 30 years. I'll show you some of that in our coastal urbanization lecture next week. Bottom line is, it's very difficult to maintain the standard of living here when we have these rates of population change. Now, what happens in other parts of the world like Nigeria and Congo, you just simply take your wealth and divide it in half. which means your economic prospects, your healthcare systems are all overwhelmed and underfunded because you're just adding too many people too fast. And so this really leads to despair, it leads to economic deprivation, and it leads to a much lower quality of life and standard of living. This slide sort of puts world population growth in a little better perspective. As you can see in this slide, that you can see world populations are pretty well stabilized, and then boom, we see the Industrial Revolution, and we see this tremendous logarithmic rate of population growth. This is unprecedented. And this is what led Paul Ehrlich to write The Population Bomb 40 or 50 years ago, because we have pretty well, through most of historical time of man, moved along at very low rates of population growth, and then all of a sudden we have hit these historic rates of population growth like we see in these slides, this set of slides right here. This is unprecedented. And so we have not seen this type of population growth until more recent times. And if we do not curtail this rate of population growth, remains to be seen whether we can sustain what will happen with the quality of life on planet Earth. Because we will rapidly approach carrying capacity for high standards of living across the globe with this kind of population growth. And this slide just really sort of makes that point with this rapid, this slide has information on carrying capacity at the top. And as you can see under different population scenarios, we're rather quickly going to be approaching, with current agricultural technology, our ability to feed the world's population. And so the amount of arable land that it will be needed to feed the world will be approached rather quickly unless we come up with more productive agriculture. Climate change adds another variable to that. We may see extended growing seasons, but we also see some of the attendant problems we talked about with weeds and things such as this. So it really remains to be seen when we will be approaching carrying capacity for food production globally. But we're getting there rather quickly. And these are going to be the kinds of issues that we have to, take steps. We already have parts of the world where people don't have enough food. And so this will become a more widespread, rampant problem, and one that we will have to address in the future. This next slide really presents the idea of what we have to hope for the future will happen to stabilize world population growth. And this is what we call demographic transition theory. Now, if we start to the left of this slide, you'll see the birth rates in red, death rates in blue, and we see the total population sort of in light blue. And so you'll notice phase one, pre-industrial revolution, you'll notice that birth rates and death rates were pretty well balanced. Population growth was pretty stable. Then all of a sudden, you'll notice that with the improvements in healthcare delivery, public health, and prevention, you'll notice that suddenly the death rates dropped dramatically during what we call the phase two transitional period. But you'll notice that during that time period, birth rates stayed the same. So as that happened, look what happened to your population growth. We had this unprecedented period of continued population growth, and that's because medical advances can occur at a faster rate, and technological advances can occur and be implemented at a much more faster rate than the cultural changes that have to take place to reduce the fertility rate. And so you'll notice that as we move to the phase three transition, suddenly we begin to see the fact that birth rates do drop. And as birth rates eventually drop and approach the lower death rates at the end of phase three, notice what happens to your population growth. It begins to level out. And so at the far right of this graph, we reach for phase four, which is we call the industrial, revolution time period we should be in. And what we see there is we see clearly that births have now adjusted. The number of births have dropped down to the levels we see in the United States and most of the developed countries of the world. And when that happens, you achieve stable population growth again. The problem is most of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, we have introduced medical advances that have reduced the death rates there. What we have not done is we have not put in place those programs to curtail births, and because of that, the cultural transition is occurring much slower. And until the recognition is made in that part of the world, those parts of the world, that a large family size is not a measure of your wealth, but rather it is a drain on your wealth, then we will continue to see high rates of population growth there and lowered standards of living. So eventually we hope that those areas with the introduction of birth control measures can achieve those kinds of steady state conditions we see in other parts of the world. If that happens, then we will not approach these carrying capacities and hopefully stay at or above the ability to produce enough food to maintain populations here on the planet. So this really introduces sort of two terms: complete demographic transition as opposed to incomplete. Right now, the developed nations of the world, like the United States and the European Union nations, have what we call complete demographic transition. They have made it all the way, as we showed on that the preceding graph, from the early pre-industrial population with birth rates and death rates balanced, down to lowered death rates and lowered birth rates as they become an industrialized society. When we reach that, we have gone through that complete demographic transition. The problem is the majority of the population of the world is in what we call incomplete demographic transition, and that's where there are still high birth rates with very low death rates, which have been advanced because of medical advances, which occur much faster than the cultural changes that lead to reduced birth rates. So if we want to really improve the life and quality of life in developing nations, it's not just about going in and bringing in clean water, good sanitation, immunization programs, preventive health. It's also about medical education to reduce the number of births. If we do not do that, we will only achieve incomplete demographic transition, and rather than creating a fire to improve the standard of living in these countries, we actually create a firestorm that lowers the standard of living. And so we have to help these nations complete this demographic transition so that they too can achieve steady population growth in their countries, as opposed to this rampant population doubling times of 25 to 50 years. It's just not a stable economic picture for those kinds of countries. That leads to political unrest. It also leads, as we'll show you in a minute, to population dynamics in those countries that tend to destabilize economic security and political security within the borders. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. This slide is just another comparison between the core countries, which are your economically developed countries like the United States, and the rest of the world, the undeveloped nations of the world in sub-Saharan Africa, Asian Rim, other parts of the world, some parts of the Middle East, some parts of Central America, where we have the incomplete demographic transition. You'll notice that in the developing nations, we have made a complete demographic transition. However, you'll notice in the developing nations of the world, in pink, the birth rates are still way above the death rates. They are not approaching. And really, we have to achieve this harmony in reducing this size of the incomplete demographic transition that we see, this disparity between birth rates and death rates in the developing nations of the world and most of the world's population. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve stable population. So this covers a period from 1775, really right at the start of the Industrial Revolution to present. So you can really see how that has changed. Now in this slide, what we have begun to look at is the rate of population growth. And so in the color-coded maps, what you see is the countries in dark blue have rates of population increase of over 3%. What that means is those are areas of the world that have population doubling times of 23 years or less. And so you can see that those are the places in the world we've talked about already in terms of life expectancy. And these are where we have the highest rates of population growth. You'll notice that in the United States and most of the developing nations of the world, we have population growth rates of 0.1%. Or that range, and doubling times that are on the orders of hundreds of years as a result of that. So if the only way we can really decrease populations is that our death rate is higher than our birth rates. As long as there are net births to deaths, populations will increase. So we're really trying to standardize. If you think about that little beaker again with inputs equal outputs, as long as the inputs exceed the outputs, the water level in that beaker rises and populations continue to grow. If the water level, if the outputs increase the inputs, then the water level in that beaker declines and world populations decline. And if you really think about that in terms of total food supply, total energy for the planet, the fewer number of people sharing those measures of wealth and well-being really will improve if you're able to spread that around among fewer people. If you have to spread that among more and more and more people, then you're left with essentially lowering your standard of living and quality of life. This is just an enlarged screenshot of the previous slide. And again, what we really see here is we really see in this enlargement, you can see that the areas in blue, light blue and dark blue, are where we have high rates of population growth. And I should mention Central America and parts of South America. And I'm not picking on people, but one of the problems that we have is one of the world's largest religions does not believe in certain types of contraception. And because of that, that really does mean that in particularly in places where that particular religion, the Catholic religion, is very popular, in Hispanic nations, for example, in Central and South America, we still are left with very high rates of birth rates. And so I'm not picking on religion here. I'm only picking on the facts that religion is part of culture. And culture has to help us solve this problem because it is the changing perceptions of family size that have to change. And that starts at home, that starts at work, that starts at church, at school, wherever it may be, as part of our social fabric. And so clearly we have to articulate those policies not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but we have to do it in these other parts of the world as well. You'll notice that in China, we still have a high birth rate and low death rate, and still high net population growth. The United States still has a ways to go. Europe and Russia have pretty well reached more stability or no net population growth, and those should be the goals and targets for the entire world. If we're to sustain a world that will reach stability, I think, in terms of reducing tensions about standards and quality of life. Because it's really the perception of lack of quality of living that leads to political instability and leads to many of the problems we have worldwide. But there is an underlying population factor to this. Now let's talk about birth rates decrease when children are not needed as part of the labor force. We saw that in the United States as we moved from an agrarian society which needed lots of hands, lots of labor on the farm, to an industrial society. We saw birth rates go down. We also see birth rates decrease when urbanization increases. As people move to the city and realize the cost of living, no need for producing food, but rather buying food, which requires wealth. So again, in urban settings, we have better access to family planning for birth control and other factors like abortions. Reduced needs, there's no need for producing your own food. You can buy your food. The cost to raise children increases. We know that education is not free, but it costs. And then the educational employment opportunities for women increase. As women become employed, they tend to have fewer children. So again, that is a very big part of this. Infant mortality rates drop and marriage age increases. So what we see is as women become employed, they're getting married later and having families later. And then another factor are private and public pensions become available. People are planning for their future and postponing having children. And so again, that contributes to the overall reduction in birth rates. And then finally, I mentioned earlier, the religious traditions and cultures. As I mentioned with the Catholic Church, we have to pay attention to those. Not picking on anybody or any one religion. I'm only saying those become problematic when we do not recognize other methods of birth control which could help us with family planning and preventing unwanted pregnancies. Now, if we look on the other side, on the outputs, death rates have decreased due to the increased food supply and distribution of food, stability of food, better nutrition, that is, preventive health planned through nutrition to prevent heart disease, cancer, medical and public health improvements, particularly immunizations, antibiotics, which have helped us greatly reduce both vector-borne and infectious disease and vector-borne diseases, and also medical prevention programs, improve sanitation and personal hygiene. As I've told you earlier, if you really want to improve society and the standard of living, providing safe drinking water and proper and safe sanitation are the two single biggest things we can do to improve the standard of living in most of the developing nations of the world. And then finally, safe water supplies are part of that as well. Life expectancy has increased, and this is another factor affecting population growth. So the average number of years a newborn born today will live has dramatically increased. We said over 75 to 80 plus years life expectancy. We've added 30 years in the last 40, 50 years. Infant mortality rate has decreased. The infant mortality rate is the number of babies per 1,000 that die before their first birthday. And this is one of the most important measures of the society, of the standard of living in a society. A high rate means not enough food, poor nutrition, a high level of infectious disease, and poor access to prenatal care. Those are usually the biggest factors that contribute to infant mortality rate. And so clearly those are a measure of the standard of living in a society. And so high infant mortality rates really are a measure of quality of life. So again, in just reviewing our study and lecture to date, population change is a function of inputs and outputs. The inputs are births and immigration in, and we talked about the importance of immigration here in the U.S., for example, is a large part of our population growth. And then we have the outputs, which are deaths and immigration, that is migration out of a country. And so those are really the drivers that really contribute in the inputs and outputs on our beaker. If those are in balance, the beaker level stays level. If either one of those are out of whack, the beaker either goes up, level goes up, or it goes down. Now let's talk a little bit about movement and migration. Immigration is moving from a nation, from a location, out of a location, out of a country. Immigration with an I is moving to a country. And so we know that we have a large problem in this nation with illegal immigration at our borders, particularly our southern borders with Mexico. What is the driver for that? Higher standard of living, better quality of life. Poor standard of living and poor quality of life is what is the trigger for people to move away from Mexico and Central America. There can also be international migrations when we have political unrest. In a country like Syria, we see that the immigrants flee those countries into neighboring countries. And we're beginning to see more and more of that occur with political unrest around the world. And we are ill-equipped to handle that. And how do you have humanitarian policies for people who are being slaughtered, gassed with nerve gases in Syria, things like this? How can you not open your borders and be humanitarian? On the other hand, can you afford to be that way? Can you afford to have that capacity? And how do you really control it and maintain your own borders and security and stability in your own population? We really don't have global programs really focused at that. It really is up to the politics within a country as to how big their heart is and how big their measure is in handling this type of mass migration. And then we also have what's called internal migration within a country. And I mentioned earlier, we have it right here, a big issue in the United States with mass migration to our coastal areas. With baby boomers retiring, more and more and more of the baby boomers are moving from particularly up north down to the southeast and particularly settling along our coastal areas. And as we said, over 50% of the U.S. population lives in the coastal zone. That means there are 5 times more people per land area in those coastal areas than there are in the other parts of the U.S., the more inland parts. And that becomes a huge issue with climate change, sea level rise along our coast, and also with increasing storm frequency, those kinds of things, and climate change in general. So we'll talk a lot more about those as we move through this class and some of the ramifications. As I said earlier, parts of our coastline right here in South Carolina have population doubling times that rival what we see in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, again, when we look at population immigration and look at where populations are distributed and their structure, where are these populations concentrated? What are the causes and consequences of such distributions? With the tendency toward urbanization, that is people moving from the country into cities because of economic opportunities, we tend to see large urban centers and large urban populations. And most of those urban populations are concentrated along the coastal areas, not only of the U.S., but of the world. Again, 50% of the world's population lives in the coastal zone, not in inland areas. So we do see clustering of populations along our coastlines of the world. Our coastal areas are the center of global trade. Goods and services are exchanged between countries for economic trade. 33 of the 50 largest cities in the world are located in coastal areas. And then finally, what we call population density and composition. What are the total populations per land area? That is a measure of the quality of life in many places. And we know in our coastal areas of the United States, for example, there's 5 times more people per square mile, and there's 5 times more economic activity and related pollution that goes with that economic activity. So coastal areas clearly are faced with some of the greatest stress because of the clustering of populations. This next slide really gives you an idea of the concentration of population density. And you'll notice that in countries like China and India, we have the highest, as we said, they're a third of the world's population or more, 37%. And you can see that in China, India, we have 16% of the world's population, but only 2.3% of the land, 2% of the forest. China, 21% of the world's population, 7% of the water and cropland, and 4% of the forest. So the real point is that if we do not reach population stability in these countries, they will have to look to expand their sphere of influence or their borders in some way. Either their economic borders or their legal borders. And this has led to political instability in the world through wars. So we really don't want that. You'll notice that in places like Canada, in Russia, Australia, we have some of the lowest population densities per land area. You'll notice in the United States we're somewhere between 20 to 40. If you go to some of our coastal areas, though, we're approaching population densities 400 people per square mile. And so that map can be, since it's averaged, can be misleading. Because if you look at, we have 50% of the population in the U.S. living on 11% of the land area in our coastal zones. And that leads to much higher population densities. So in many parts of the United States, we are approaching the kinds of problems that we're having in in China and India. And I think given that, it's very interesting. India and China send delegations over and talk to the folks in our coastal zone management agencies all the time, because we are dealing with some of the very same problems they're dealing with as a country. So there's a lot of technological exchange on methods to improve environmental quality and maintain sustainability within those areas for water and the like in urban development, better managing urban development. Anyway, this map just really sort of gives you an indication. And I think one of the other points on this map, even though we talk about the rate of population growth in Africa, you'll still notice that Africa still has somewhat overall low population numbers per land area, with the exception of a couple of countries in West Africa. I think that's Nigeria that we see in blue. But I think the rest of the area does not have disproportionate densities yet, but they will approach those densities like Nigeria in the short term if indeed we do not see complete demographic transition there. So one of the things we look at when we look at, again, population distributions and structure is the nutritional density, that is the total number of people per total land area under cultivation. Because that can only be at a certain ratio to be sustainable. If you exceed the total number of people, a certain ratio to land cultivable area, without significant technological advances in farming, you're not going to be able to continue to feed the world's food supply. Agricultural density is defined as total agriculturalist per total farmable land. And so again, you've probably seen the bumper stickers here, less than 5% of the U.S. population, which farmers feed the entire nation. And we mentioned earlier that there are only 7 nations in the world that actually produce more food than they consume. So we have to be very smart about our agricultural policies. For example, if you go to Russia had a complete failure under the communist system of going to collective farms. The agricultural policies under communism really were a failure, particularly in the agricultural area. If you go to Russia today, about half of the food in Russia is produced in family farms, basically gardens, not farms, not family farms, but gardens. People have their own gardens, and in fact, when you visit Eastern Europe, I did not pick up on this until I visited, but people will take you outside of the town they live in and show you their garden. And I thought that was kind of interesting that they had a garden, but then I suddenly realized that the reason they were showing me that garden is that was a measure of their wealth, because being able to have your own garden and produce your own food meant that your family was well fed. And so we take that as for granted in this country, where food supplies are cheap, are plentiful rather, and cheap food supplies are cheap and plentiful. In other parts of the world, they don't have that same luxury. So we have to keep that in mind as we look at overall population and quality of life within populations around the world. Now this slide is just a reminder of our term carrying capacity. We talked earlier about carrying capacity was the ability of a given habitat to sustain life. And all ecosystems have, whether they're agricultural, man-made, or natural, have defined carrying capacities. And the carrying capacities of our ecosystems within a country, within borders, within the globe, define the ability to sustain life. And there are certain necessities needed for population growth. You have to have an adequate water and food supply. You have to have an adequate climate in which to live. This in turn helps define your healthy populations. And then you actually have to have adequate space. Now, for example, in most cities, when we move into an urban complex, we increase the carrying capacity by building up, that is, building vertical up. so we can put more people per square mile. One of the things we've seen in the southeastern U.S., as we have urbanized the southeast, instead of building up, we have sprawled and built out. So we have built large metropolitan areas with large commuting urban distances, as opposed to centralized cities with mass transit and those types of things. So we have built a different type of urban structure in certain parts of this country compared to others. Most of the world, when we look at urban complexes, they build up, not out. And in fact, many conferences I've been to, for example, one of the best mass transit systems in the U.S. is out in Portland, Oregon. And one of the things they did there is they actually put a defined urban boundary. And so if there were any new housing developments proposed outside of that urban boundary, the counties in that metropolitan area would not allow them. They had to be maintained within the urban boundaries. So what that did is that forced folks to build up and not out, to renew older housing developments and improve housing within the city, and that encouraged mass transit and development of commercial services, that is restaurants, food, grocery stores, drug stores, things such as that, places of commerce within easy walking distance of the mass transit systems. And so that really helps better define the ability to move in an urban area, is if you can live and walk reasonably to the goods and services you need. If you have to drive everywhere you go, that crowds the streets and it makes it impossible. So it's very important to develop your mass transit systems within cities. Now, if we're talking about natural areas, on the other hand, we want to be sure that we have an adequate water and sanitation wherever we go. And so that usually starts as on-site systems with private wells and septic tanks, but as we see succession occur within a human ecosystem, you move from private wells and septics to centralized water and sewer. And so again, those maintain the ability to have higher population densities as you move more and more people within an area. One of the things we should mention that really is important here in looking at natural versus man-made ecosystems is the type of reproductive strategies we see employed within the population. And so we have two basic kinds of reproductive strategies. We have equilibrium strategies and we have opportunistic strategies, called K and R respectively. The equilibrium, or K, we have few numbers of offspring per individual per female, and that would be the kind of reproductive strategy we see in most mammals and higher life forms, including man. On the other hand, what we see in natural populations of insects and vertebrates, we see a very large number of offspring per individual. And on the other hand, we see the natural mortality rate is very low under K, whereas the natural mortality rate is quite high. In fact, 90% of most of the opportunistic reproduction, the organisms, 99% of them die. So again, we see these two diverse strategies in terms of reproduction. And I mentioned earlier, for the non-human species, this equilibrium reproduction really makes any kind of stress assessment difficult, because when you're trying to look at the effect of pollution, stressors, and other things, 99% of your organisms die naturally due to natural factors. Whereas in human populations, we just don't see that. Only a very small percentage of infant mortality rates are low. So we don't see that type of phenomena with the equilibrium reproduction. So again, getting back, and that reproductive strategy really factors in here too, looking at our carrying capacity. If all the ingredients for population growth are present, then a population will reach its population potential, or carrying capacity. That is the maximum number of living beings on a given ecosystem that ecosystem will sustain. Now, when we look at factors, or what we call limiting factors, that limit population growth and create environmental resistance, again, it's the availability of water and food supply, overcrowding, disease, predation in natural systems, accumulation of toxic substances, war, and again, the reproductive capacity of a given species, whether it's using a complete or incomplete demographic transition among equilibrium reproduction, or if it's an opportunistic strategy among different types of organisms, as opposed to an equilibrium strategy. All of these play a huge role in terms of understanding how populations grow. As we look at these factors that limit population growth. Now, this is an interesting question. Just to give you an example of a human disease that may or may not have an effect on populations. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Has this had an impact on world population? Worldwide, no. But in certain countries of Africa and Asia, the answer is yes, as it has been shown to drop the population growth rate from 2.5 to 3%, which is, doubling times of 25 to 30 years, to somewhere between 0.5 to 2%, much lower doubling times. So it has really, in effect, been a population control. Now, I only point out this because there are 33.6 million cases of AIDS in 14.8 million cases in women, 18.8 million cases in men, 1.2 million in AIDS orphans. And I think what we see today is AIDS has much more heterosexual transmission than when first discovered in the 1980s. I can remember sitting in this class and talking about how this was a disease, according to the CDC, a disease transmitted by Haitian male immigrants. We didn't know why. And then as we understood the disease, as we learned more about it, we suddenly realized it was a lifestyle issue among men, not just Haitian men. Now, the other thing I'll point out, with the number of deaths in the U.S., for example, we have more deaths today with antibiotic-resistant infections than we have AIDS. So here's another example. These highly antibiotic-resistant infections are another factor that may curtail population in certain countries, probably not in the world itself. But I do think we have to put that up there as another example. Since AIDS has been a determinant in some countries, it's very likely that highly resistant infections are playing a role as well in certain countries of the world. Globally, antibiotic-resistant infections probably are not, but in certain countries they probably have. Now, the AIDS infection rate in the U.S. with most advanced medical treatment worldwide and in developed nations is about 0.6%. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, it's over 10 times higher, 7.4%. And so clearly it is a much more prevalent disease there because of the access to drugs and education on prevention. This is why drug makers are making AIDS drugs available in many of these areas. For example, in urbanized areas of Kenya, the infection rate is 25%. Urbanized areas of Zimbabwe, AIDS infection rates are 30%. In Botswana, 25% of all people ages 15 to 49 have AIDS, and 40% of all pregnant women are infected. So if that kind of gives you a reason why we have to be a little humanitarian about some of the things we do, here's why. But clearly it is having an impact on populations in some of these sub-Saharan Africa countries. One of the ways we can often look at the population growth in a country is to plot the age distributions and number of people by age distributions for males and females. And so these are called age-sex pyramids. And what we generally see is, if you have a very stable population, you'll have good, equitable distributions at all ages. In developing nations, what we will see is very low numbers of individuals in the upper age groups because people don't live that long. And we'll see much higher numbers in the lower population because births exceed deaths, and we're adding more people at the bottom of these pyramids. Now, what we see in this is a plot of Germany looking at the effect of both World War I and World War II. If we look at the top of these graphs, for the males, since the males were primarily involved in those two wars. Although the people did suffer in Germany with the bombing and other things. So females were affected, but to a lesser degree. You clearly see the effect of both the World War I and World War II. You'll notice that little big gap in the age group at the around 70 years of or older. Those are the World War II people that were killed. And so you'll see that in both the male and female population there. The other thing this graph points out is there were an excess number of females per male after the World War II, which led to a post-war baby boom. And anyway, you can pretty well, and you can see that at the bottom of the pyramid in the younger age cohorts. And so again, you can see that deficit between the pre and post there as a result of that. So it's very interesting. We can look at population growth in this way and examine countries from around the world, and we see differing patterns and different trends. Now, one of the things we are seeing is a graying of the world's population in developing nations. Life expectancy has increased more in the last 50 years than in the previous 5,000 years of man's existence. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, only 2 to 3% of people lived beyond age 65. Today, that figure is 14%, and by 2030, 25% of the world's population will be older than age 65. Florida has 19% of the population classified as elderly, that is older than age 65. And this is defined as what we call the Sunshine State, and that's not because of the name Florida, but we call that Sunshine State reaching that 65-year milestone. And the following countries will reach this Sunshine State status: Italy in 2003, Japan 2005, Germany 2006, France 2016, U.S. 2021, U.K. 2016, Canada 2021. By 2025, 50% of all Italians will be over age 50, and 33% of all Japanese will be over age 80. So as you see population stability within populations, you have an higher proportion of older people in your population in developed nations of the world. Now, this leads to problems in terms of being able to sustain and maintain and take care of these older people, particularly as their health begins to fail later in life. So we have welfare programs and social programs like Social Security and retirement programs which take care of the elderly. Right now on Social Security, we have 3 taxpayers paying into Social Security per pensioner, and that's because of the baby boomers. But once the baby boomers retire, we're now going to be only having 1.5 taxpayers paying in per pensioner, which means either one of two things. Either they have to tax you guys, your generation, at double the rate, or you have to reduce what we get as baby boomers. And so I think this is a huge cultural and social issue that we're going to have to address in the future in this nation. The U.S. will spend an additional 9 to 16% of the gross domestic product, not only to cover Social Security, just to cover Social Security. So that's nearly 20% of our wealth will just be spent on taking care of the older people. And if you add in the Medicare and Medicaid costs, which that projection does not include, we're going to be spending over half of our GDP on taking care of people's health and well-being as they get older and their health throughout their lives. So this really means that, that really can be a drag on your economic prosperity if you're spending half of your economic output on these types of programs. This rate of taxpayer pensioner of 1.5% per taxpayer per pensioner does not include the policy that we have with immigrants. If we allow normal immigration policies to take place and are more proactive on our immigration, we will easily go to 3 taxpayers per pensioner, even with the baby boomers. And that other 1.5 pensioners will come from immigrants. That's why it's very important that if we're going to have immigration, those people be properly documented so they are paying into these systems, because when they do retire, those people will hopefully be receiving benefits during their senior years under Social Security. That's why it's very important that we have to have documentation of people moving here so that they're paying their fair share. This is a graph of rising life expectancy, which really kind of gets to this graying of the population or sunshine state. And so what we see is in developed nations of the world, we're sitting with life expectancy at 75 years plus. In black is the world projected life expectancy of around 65 plus years. And then in blue, the less developed nations. And you'll notice, 30, 40, 50 years ago, life expectancy in those developed nations of the world was only 40 years or less, or right around 40 to 50 years. You'll notice that it has gone above almost age 65 with improvements in medical treatment, immunizations, things such as this. Clearly, we see the greatest increase in life expectancy there, whereas we see that it is somewhat leveled off in more recent times in developed nations. But we still see today in the U.S. life expectancies of around 78 and above 80 in some areas of the world. This slide is an example of changes in what we call epidemiological transition. This is in Mexico. And you'll notice in the 1930s, these are number of deaths per 100,000. The leading cause of death in the 1930s was dysentery, malaria, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever. You'll notice that as we introduce vaccines for typhoid, the tuberculosis rate and better treatments there have gone dramatically down. You'll notice with the introduction of malaria eradication programs, we've virtually eradicated malaria, and we've seen dramatic improvements in sanitation, which have brought all those death rates down. As a result, life expectancy has gotten higher, and so now what we begin to see by the 1970s is the increase in the number of deaths from cancer and heart disease, so that right now they become number 2 and 3 behind, diarrheal diseases. So we clearly see this changing epidemiological transition towards a more advanced society where, infectious disease becomes less of your cause of death. And in fact, in modern Mexico today, we have pretty well brought those number of diarrheal diseases down even lower. But this slide just sort of illustrates that trend. So what we really see here, this slide sort of makes out this point between the median age differences between developed and developing nations. Not mean, but median age. So you'll notice that in most of the developed countries of the world, the median age is around age 30 or higher. 30 for the United States, up to high 38 for Germany, right around 30 for Russia, China a little lower, 23. Now, if we come to developing nations, again, where the leading cause of death is not cancer and heart disease as we see in these developed nations, but rather the leading cause of death is still infectious disease and other quality of life issues, sanitation, things such as this. We generally see the median age ranges between 14 to 19. And in places like Kenya and Botswana, 14 years. That basically means you have populations where the age distributions are much different between developing nations and undeveloped nations. And this leads to tremendous differences politically and economically. The economic conditions are much less stable in these undeveloped nations, and because so much of the population is centered with young people, this tends to lead to political instability among those nations. Also, the lack of large portions of the population being wise and elderly, to give that wisdom to pass along to the younger people in these underdeveloped nations, basically adds to that political instability in these areas. So just to illustrate that point, here are a comparison between the United States, Denmark, and Kenya. Now, the United States and Denmark would both be considered developing nations. So what we have are age cohorts by male and female, and comparing those in very stable countries with very low population growth in the United States, or zero population growth. And so what you generally tend to see is very good age distributions among your lowest and oldest parts of your population, with your highest proportions in your sort of your optimum age from 30 to 40 years of age. You'll notice that in Kenya, we have very few people that live to be elderly. Most of the population is age less than 20 years of age. Whereas when we look at the populations in the Denmark and United States, the majority of the population is age 20 to 60. So that tends to lead to a different social dynamic in terms of political unrest in a lot of these countries where so much of the population is young, looking for economic opportunities, not seeing those being met. And so this can lead to destabilization of the politics and political unrest in these countries. And it's no surprise that we see things like terrorism and basically dictatorships in these countries because of the political unrest in many of these parts of the world. On the other hand, we generally tend to see more stable political and population growth, and as a result, political growth and stability within these more developed nations. This really, makes me pause for a minute to talk about wealth. Quality of life is very good in both the United States and Denmark. And it's not that good in many of the developed nations of the world like Kenya. And so this really means, how do we continue to maintain our standard of living here in light of the rest of the world that's living in poverty? I don't know that I have an answer for that other than being humanitarian. But is humanitarian going to be enough to sustain us on a global stage when more and more of the world population, at one point in the next 50 years, 90% of the world's population is going to be living in poverty? And so that really begs the question, how do you maintain your political stability in a global village where so few of the people have so little of the goods and services? So I think these are the kinds of issues in your life cycle, your lifetime rather, not life cycle, your lifetime, you're going to have to face as a society here in the United States and other developed nations of the world. It's going to take more global consideration and acting more as a global body among these developed nations of the world like the United States and the European Union and other countries to maintain, world order. And I think it also means we have to begin to look at how we can create economic opportunities in these other parts of the world so that we raise the standard of living in those areas at a way and means that is of convenience and acceptability to our countries as well as the other parts of the world. This is a graph of the U.S. population from 1960 to 2040. And it's just done to illustrate the effect of the baby boomer population from World War II on our population age distributions. And they're in light blue. So if you take a look starting at the top left slide and then move left or right across the top and then left or right across the bottom, you can move across these different time frames and see how the baby boomers move from the bottom to the top of the population as they age, and how they have had such a profound impact. You'll notice that we have the baby boomers when they were in their childbearing years, and then we see the results of the baby boomers' children having children later in life, and how that really affected our population. But if you look at the overall U.S. population, we have maintained very good population distributions among almost all of our cohorts. Clearly, we would have had more men in those baby boomers had we not had the war. So overall, though, we see just the effect of more recent events on our age population distributions. Now, we talked earlier about how urbanization is a real big issue, and there is a trend in this country as well as the world for people to move into cities away from rural settings into urban settings. And cities begin to develop as the nations become more advanced. Many of the largest cities in the world, we said 33 of the 50 largest cities of the world are located in the coastal zone, and there is this trend toward increasing population growth in coastal areas, not only in the U.S., but around the world. And we'll talk specifically about that in our next lecture next week. Now, I want to talk a little bit about mobility and migration within populations, both within a country and between countries. There can be what we call push and pull factors. Push factors push people out of a country, such as civil war, political unrest. We mentioned the refugees in Syria moving across the borders to neighboring countries like Jordan and other countries. And then we have the pull, which is the United States is a pull for illegal immigration from Central and South America because of the higher standard of living. There are voluntary migrations, and then there are forced migrations. People voluntarily try to immigrate to this country legally. There is a lot of forced migration. Many people seek political asylum in this country because they are in countries where there's political unrest. I know I had a former graduate student whose father was a prosecutor in Colombia who was assassinated, and her family was moved here and forced out of Colombia because of the drug cartel. And she lives here and works here today as a toxicologist here in Colombia. So we see those examples like that. A lot of forced migration. Many people in Central and South America are drawn here not because of just the higher standard of living. What really propels them is the poor standard of living where they live. And that's because of the drug cartel and other things and the instability of life. If you had all your family murdered, I think each of us would be saying, do we really still want to live here? Do I want to raise my kids in a place where my mom and dad and all my brothers have been killed? I would probably right away want to move somewhere else. And so I don't think we really think about those kinds of things. So there can be environmental migrants, areas where we are experiencing drought, lack of food, lack of natural resources, can be an environmental draw that forces people to leave and can be a push to leave a region. So we see this in different countries around the world where political and environmental issues can really affect immigration and out of countries to other regions. I want to mention population and resources for just a minute because this really does define quality of life. Thomas Malthus was a population scientist who studied population growth and who lived in the 1700s. And one of the things that Malthus realized is that populations grow faster than the food supply. And because of that, famine is almost always inevitable. That was sort of his thesis. So therefore, it's very important to control reproduction. It was his sort of Malthusian doctrines. Otherwise, you do not have stable food supplies, and that leads to political unrest. There are what we call today many neo-Malthusians, where population growth will lead to disaster. And so today, Malthusian philosophy still permeates much of what we see in society. Now, we see a lot of theory here on population growth that was contributed by G.F. Goss. Goss really led us to look at these population curves, which we call S and J-shaped curves. And what basically Goss was able to show is that we have these population growth curves that occur in natural populations. And Goss studied things like parameciums and looked at their natural growth under ideal conditions. And what he found was under plentiful supplies of food, populations will take off and you have this rapid rate of population growth. And then you have what's called an overshoot effect, where you actually produce more individuals than you have carrying capacity, and that brings the population growth back down to more sustainable limits. So Goss really helped us understand how natural populations work in terms of population growth. We also have the studies done by Skinner, who was a noted psychiatrist, who studied crowding in rats. And what Skinner found was, as rats are crowded under increasing conditions, as we would find, for example, in cities, this causes stress response. They produce cortical steroids, which can lead to aggression. They basically put out male hormones among, like, female rats, for example, or more male hormones among male rats. And these studies of rats that Skinner used, looking at crowded conditions, looking at the production of these corticosteroids, basically led to see that there was more fighting among rats, with the fighting often leading to fatalities, as opposed to under less crowded conditions. The rats might fight but only take a bite and not kill each other. We also saw among these studies that there was greater potential for females to abandon their nest and basically neglect their young under stressful conditions. We also saw basically that more potential for what would be equated as sex abuse. That is, as the male rats become more aggressively, they mount unwilling females more frequently, as opposed to under normal conditions, and they often try to mate with young immature females, which has been equated to increasing rape and things like this. So there's some very interesting basically social derivations from Skinner's study that have led from our study and understanding of crowding. We also know that crowding does lead to disease and increasing disease, so that is an underlying factor of the increased cortical steroids and stress that underlies crowded populations. Now, we mentioned earlier in the U.S. about how we have this dramatic change in coastal populations with urbanization. And this is a slide looking at the percent population growth change from 1980 to 2005. And you can see the areas in red along the southeast coast, all the way from North Carolina all the way to Florida and through much of the Gulf Coast, as well as parts of the Pacific Northwest, California, middle Atlantic states. You can see that we've had well over 100% increase in population, a doubling of population in many of these areas. So this really means that if we're really looking at rapidly changing areas in the U.S., this is where we see the most dramatic change. And we'll talk a lot more about that next week when I talk about urbanization a little bit more. Of course, one of the things that makes absolutely very poor common sense here is to have a moving shift of populations to coastal areas with the increasing concern about climate change, particularly sea level rise, and coastal vulnerabilities that may be associated with climate change, with increasing frequency and intensity of tropical storms and things such as this. So you really see these areas in red. U.S. Geological Survey, USGS, has developed a coastal vulnerability score. And so what we really see when you plot out these slides with that index, some of the same areas that have the highest rates of population growth are the most vulnerable area in terms of sea level rise. The highest rate of sea level rise in the lower 48 states is in North Carolina, right around Cape Hatteras. And so this leads to great concerns about continuing to shift high proportions of our population to coastal areas. And this just underscores the concern about that population shift in this country, as well as the rest of the world. Because as more and more of the world moves to coastal areas, it's not like we have a market on sea level rise here in hurricanes. These kinds of phenomena occur at coastal areas around the world. This next slide just sort of points out a couple of examples about too many people for the environment. And we mentioned this problem with crowding in coastal areas. We have other areas around the world in Sahelian Africa, in some of the arid environments there, very low rainfall, very poor soils, very limited agricultural output. You just do not have high carrying capacity in these areas. Rwanda, another part of Africa, too much rain, very poor quality soils and high output. Very high quality soils, very high output. So you can really go from one extreme to the other depending upon where you are. So you have some areas that are just not going, where we have like savannas that have a rainy season and a dry season. And if you have extended dry seasons with climate change because of increased drought, you're just not going to have that agricultural production. The other concern we have is, while we may have adequate rainfall and plenty of good soils now in Rwanda, what about in the future with climate change? If we have more and more rainfall, does that affect the agricultural sustainability in that area? Again, if we look at these problems in Africa, in Sahelian Africa, which are the savanna regions, this has primarily been pastoral land, which undergoes what we call pastoralism, the large natural rangelands. And because of the lack of stable food supplies, populations have had to remain mobile to move where there's adequate food. On the other hand, we have in Rwanda both pastoral practices and farming. So there's less land required to feed people, and you tend to have more stable and fixed populations. So your policies in environmental response to those policies on agriculture can have a major factor in the ability to maintain population stabilities within a region. So these local specific problems can ultimately be repeated around the globe and become global issues. And certainly climate change adds one of these additional dynamics to this. With changing precipitation patterns, we're mentioning right here in the U.S. how we're moving the breadbaskets further north into Minnesota and southern Canada. How's that going to affect Kansas and some of these other agricultural areas where the heartland of America is now? It will be interesting to see how we adapt to climate change and how we are able to still sustain our food production in this country and in other parts of the world with this changing dynamic. Climate change can add to destabilization of agricultural systems if you do not have the capacity to adapt to climate. So populations will try to manage these impacts and be adaptable, but it really does vary depending upon where you are, your degree of sustainability and adaptability in the face of climate change. So this adds a common variable around the globe that could be a factor that could bring people together as opposed to divide us. Now, this really, means that as we look at the relationship between people and the environment in populations, this becomes very critical. Migration may become a management option, a management tool that many countries adapt, moving to new locations before a large environmental catastrophe. We know that we have rapid movement of people before a tropical storm or hurricane. But have we thought about that as a practice of moving people away from the coast if indeed sea level rises? Are we going to have an abandonment policy? Or are we going to have a renourishment and a rebuild policy along our coast? Can we afford to do that? Who's going to pay for that? Somebody has to subsidize the federal insurance program, flood insurance program. And so people in Kansas, are they going to continue to rebuild those homes along the coast just so people can have a view of the ocean? That's a real fundamental question. Who decides that? Right now, the Congress has pretty well decided to quit investing in that program and make people to have to provide private insurance if they want to live there. And if we have that policy of requiring private insurance, the premiums may become so unaffordable that the market will take care of itself and people will no longer continue to build and move there, but rather abandonment may become the process and practice that we see. So moving away from disasters where disasters are frequent has to become, being climate smart and climate resilient means not repeating the same mistakes over and over and rebuilding in the same areas, but rather moving away from areas that really aren't sustainable any longer. So we're going to see remittances, that is lowering pressure on the environment by moving people out of harm's way. And then finally, new technologies. Can we develop new technologies such as genetically modified crops that will increase food production? And what are the consequences of those technologies? Will they produce more food, or will they create more problems than they solve? And we'll talk a lot more about that. We'll have a whole lecture on genetically modified crops later in this course. Right adjoining our own borders is Mexico. And here is a good example of what we might expect to see in the future. Right now, if we take a look at the population distributions in Mexico in Central America, we see that they are pretty well scattered more towards the lower part of Mexico and down into more of Central America, away from the U.S. border. But with those kinds of population pressures, we are seeing unmitigated illegal immigration as we have never seen before into the borders of the U.S. And that whole border region between Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, this is a huge issue and a huge political issue. How do we maintain humanitarian aspects of this? And of course, what's happened with illegal immigration and with legal immigration, Spanish-speaking immigrants into the U.S. have become the second largest block of voters. So how you deal with these issues has political ramifications for now and into the future as they become a larger part of the electorate here as legal citizens. So this really leads to a lot of discussion politically in this country and in the future. And this type of issue is being played out on borders in many parts of the world, not just here, but in other countries, particularly in a lot of your developed countries where we have reached population stability. If we continue with what I will say are liberal immigration policies, you are going to be diluting and changing your population demographics in these countries. And so whether or not countries will still remain open for long-term legal immigration into a country as to become a citizen, I think remains to be a real changing landscape with stabilizing world populations. Hopefully by stabilizing world populations, we can prevent the immigration out of countries and hopefully create economic opportunities so that immigration is not such an attractive thing and a necessary thing. So we're going to end this lecture by kind of looking at populations from a quality of life comparison. And we're going to look at North America, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And we're going to look at this from 4 points of view: gross domestic product, that is economic output, birth rates, life expectancy, infant mortality, and literacy rates. So what we see is, this is looking in 2000, GDP $12,000 per person. If we go to Africa, less than $800 per person, less than $900 per person, $880. So you can see this changing decrease in economic opportunity. The birth rate is only 16 in the U.S. per thousand, 2 to 3 times higher than that in these other developing nations. Life expectancy is 74, much lower, 49, 58, 63. Infant mortality, 5 to 10 times higher. And we said infant mortality is one of the best measures of quality of life. Literacy rate in the U.S., 99%, 36% in Africa. There is a real trend here. if you live in a poor country, you're not going to live long. Your life expectancy is short. High rates of infant mortality and high rates of illiteracy. Whereas if you live in a developed nation, much greater economic opportunity, much lower birth rate, life expectancy is better, infant mortality is better, and a much smarter population. So there is a big difference between the haves and the have-nots. The haves in developing nations have a good quality of life and are extremely well educated and have medical systems that provide the quality of life where they live longer and a better quality life. You just do not have that in these other poor countries where there's much more illiteracy, much poorer economic opportunity, and much lower quality of life. Now, these are more updated statistics, sort of looking at the same thing, just to sort of show you how things are getting worse in many cases. GDP in the U.S. today is $22,000, 2012. In Africa, because populations have increased, it's now $159 per person. The birth rate continues to be double to triple. Life expectancy continues to improve. It continues to be good here, much lower there, and the literacy rate hasn't really changed. So as we look at GDP and these other factors, you really see that the economic opportunities are just dwindling as population continues to grow. So as we continue to see quality of life erode in these countries, it really remains to be seen what the world's going to be like in the future. So I'll leave you with that last slide to think about, and we'll pick this up next time on our next lecture on the following Wednesday, the 24th, where we'll talk about population and urbanization. Thank you for your time today, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye now.